I'm Doug Lichtman, and this is the second of our 2 videos on fair use. From the first video, you already know the basics. Fair use permits the unauthorized copying of protected expression. So we only get here when there is expression and it's been copied. Great. You know also that Congress kind of summarized the intuitions. What are we supposed to think about? Well, a bunch of things, according to Section 107. There's that first paragraph up at the top, which talks to you about what I call the First Amendment values, comment, criticism, and so on. There's that transition word include, reminding us that the factors that are listed, they're factors, but we can consider other things too. And then there are 4 factors. Factor 1, which is largely this question of, is the accused use transformative? Does it serve a different purpose, reach a different audience, deliver a different message in some relevant way? It can't just be a derivative work, like my movie based on your book might reach a different audience, but that's not what we mean. It's transformative in some richer way that might begin to explain to us, I get why they shouldn't ask. I understand why they shouldn't pay. Factor 1, factors 2 and 3 are more building blocks for us. But then factor 4, the other big one, the effect of the use on the potential market for the copyrighted work. And remember, this is where we focus on the economic impact of this if it were to become the law. If this is a fair use, what is that going to mean big picture for my copyright system? Again, we covered this in the last video, and in the last video, I used all of that to talk with you about parody and social commentary. We looked at the Two Live Crew case. We talked about When Done Gone. I used all of that machinery to think about a very important set of ideas that, yeah, we do lean on fair use to allow you to make fun of other folks, to criticize other folks. And of course we do. We want that kind of information in the world. I want you to be able to comment. I want you to be able to make fun of. I want you to do all those things. And yet, if you had to ask permission, it just wouldn't work. Folks would say no. And in a world where you have to ask permission, you'd kind of have to pull your punches. We looked at parody. We also looked at social commentary. It's a little harder to argue, but I thought, maybe something like When Done Gone, maybe we look at the camera and say, this is so worthwhile that I don't want to make the author of When Done Gone ask. I don't want to make the author of When Done Gone pay. I want to facilitate the social commentary of that new work. And sure, it hurts Margaret Mitchell, but in the big picture, that's probably not going to mess up the copyright system, since Margaret Mitchell and people like Margaret Mitchell have been so unbelievably successful. I'm just not worried about it. In any case, that's what we covered last time. This time, I want to think about market structure, because sometimes the fair use cases are not about these kinds of artistic commentaries. They're about something totally different. They're about how we're going to organize a given copyright market. I have 2 cases I want to show you in this video. The first is a case about photocopying. And the modern example would be something like FedEx Kinko's. The example in the case was a different photocopying moment. The case itself involved the company Texaco. Texaco, the company that does oil development and research and so on, that Texaco. And what happened in the case is Texaco had subscribed to a bunch of magazines that were research magazines. And so the articles were research topics of interest to, say, their chemists. And Texaco subscribed and they'd pass the magazines around. But when some of the employees got the magazine, they would photocopy a few articles and keep them. So I'd get the magazine, I'd make some copies, I'd hand the magazine off to the employee down the hall, but I would keep a copy for my research. I wanted a copy of that document because I thought it might help me later in my job as a chemist at Texaco. A bunch of copyright holders sued, and we had a case that really became part of this line of cases about photocopying. Again, Kinko's, FedEx, the modern example, Texaco, the one in the case. Universities have copy shops, almost all of them. Any campus you go to, there's some big photocopying entity making course packs. It was a case about photocopying. And there's a bunch of things I want to point out to you about it. First, this was a case about research. The folks at Texaco who were doing the photocopying, they really were researchers at Texaco. And we know in the first paragraph of 107, Congress wrote to us about research, teaching, scholarship, criticism, First Amendment values, remember. And of course, that's then influential. One plus for what Texaco is up to is they really are doing science. But as you know, that's only the start of the conversation. Just because you're in paragraph 1, that doesn't mean it's a fair use. And so sure, it was for research, but in the case, what the copyright holders argued is they said, we're really upset that Texaco didn't pay. When you think about what the economic harm was under Factor 4, the copyright holders said Texaco should have paid us for those photocopies. And Texaco might have paid by buying more copies of the magazine, yeah. Texaco might have paid by licensing the rights just to make those photocopies. Whatever it is, the copyright holders said that's our harm. And one of the interesting things about this case is it's a little circular in the sense that I'm pointing to the harm that this defendant causes me, and I'm saying if you stop them, this defendant will pay. Why am I pointing out that that's circular? Look back at so many of the other cases we've thought of. Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison said, I'm mad at 2 Live Crew, they hurt me, but he didn't say they hurt me in the sense that if they lose the case, they'll pay me to make the parody. His point was, they hurt me in that they either stain the reputation of my original song, or they compete with other rap versions. There was some other market that was being hurt. And indeed, in a lot of fair use cases, Factor 4 harm is, stop this guy, because this guy hurts some other market. Texaco was interesting because the copyright holders said, stop this guy, so this guy pays us. But it was an interesting fight because at the time folks were nervous. It sounded circular in the sense that I always am better off if I win my case. If I sue you and you lose, that always benefits me. But that's too easy, right? Of course that's true. In this case, though, I think it's a great argument. Copyright holders say this harm that we're focused on, not some other market, not some other user, this type of user, it's really important to us. If this thing is a fair use, we're not going to make money from a bunch of researchers in this case. Or if you apply it to a copy shop at a university, right, the publisher of some great history book about Lincoln says, if the college kids aren't the ones paying either for the book or for photocopies of the chapters in a course pack, if the college kids aren't paying, who's going to pay, right? No one wants to read this except the college kids. And so it's circular in the sense that the economic harm at issue is this very harm. I want to win this case, so people like this pay me. But I have no problem with that, nor did the court ultimately, because Factor 4 is supposed to help us understand what's the stakes. Factor 4 is supposed to help us understand why might a fair use finding mess up our copyright system. So it's circular in the sense that they focused on the harm in this case, but totally fine. Another interesting in this case is the copyright holders didn't merely say Texaco should buy more copies of the magazine. They could have made that argument, but they had just at that time launched something called the Copyright Clearance Center. And it still exists today, and it's basically this intermediary that a lot of copyright holders work with, where you or I or Texaco or a university can go to the Copyright Clearance Center and say, I'd like to copy 12 pages from this thing. And the Copyright Clearance Center already has the deal in place. There's a set rate per page. You're in, now you're done. And this had just started at the time of the case, and the copyright holders used it in their Factor 4 argument. Again, they said, if this is a fair use, we're going to lose out on a bunch of revenue, and the revenue isn't this highfalutin, you'd buy more copies of the magazine, although maybe you would. It's even better, right? We're ready to be really efficient and fair and reasonable about this. We have this entity, the Copyright Clearance Center, ready to go so you can buy the rights you need. It was a newish market, but again, that's fine too. Remember, Factor 4 is trying to help us understand what's going to happen if this thing is a fair use. And yeah, I want to know what's going to happen for users like this today and tomorrow. It doesn't surprise me that we allow copyright holders to say, yesterday I might not have had a great way to license this, but tomorrow it's right here. Let me tell you about what's happening. Tomorrow I will be ready to license this. And so it's a harm to me if you declare it to be fair use. So the factor for harm was really interesting. It was about this kind of copying. It was a little bit of a newish response that the copyright holders talked about. The court came back and protected the market structure. And that's what this little video is about. Fair use here was putting at risk this market structure where I would publish a magazine, you would use it for your research, but if you wanted to photocopy pages, I wanted you to come back, pay the licensing fee at the Copyright Clearance Center, and make this market work. I want to make money based on your use of my research magazine. And so by not finding fair use, which is what happened, the court said this is not fair use. It's not even clear it's transformative. You're using the research article for, wait for it, research. Not even clear if it's transformative. It is wonderful, First Amendment values, but we're not saying not to do it. We're just saying do it through licensing. There is real factor for harm if we found this to be a fair use. It would really undermine the incentive for anyone to make these research magazines. It's not fair use, go license it. And so fair use here, by turning down what might at first seem like a sympathetic fair use, we're protecting the market structure. The last thing that I really love about this case is what it teaches about scale and efficiency. And here's what I'm thinking of. You and me, when we were in school, we would sometimes go to the library, we'd take a book off the shelf, we'd walk over to a photocopying machine in the library, and we'd put some quarters in, photocopy a couple pages. And that was kind of our way of doing photocopying from one of these resources. And I think that was fair use. The libraries were putting the photocopying machines there for us. My university literally had them all over the library, ready to go, with the quarters thing up and running. They knew what we were doing. I think they viewed it as fair use. Why is this different? Why is Texaco different? Why is Kinko's FedEx Today different? Scale and efficiency. Think of a big, sophisticated photocopying center. They're really efficient. They're really good at making copies, especially compared to me and you. We'd put the quarter in, we'd go to make the copy, and the paper would be slanted, or it would smudge, or we'd forget to grab a page, or it would just be slow, or the binding of the book would make it hard to get a clean copy, all sorts of mess. It was really small scale and inefficient. Contrast that to FedEx Kinko's. When a professor brings a book to FedEx Kinko's and says, copy chapter 2 for my students, gorgeous. Beautiful copies, bound, lovely. Because these copy shops, Texaco in the case, my example of these university copy shops now, because these copy shops are so good at what they do, two things change that are relevant to fair use. One is the extent of the harm. When you and I photocopied in the library with our quarters, it was a couple pages. We wouldn't go with like a big bag of quarters and spend 3 hours pounding them in to copy hundreds of pages. It was small scale. The harm was smaller, under factor 4. But there was a second thing. Not only was the scale different for the harm, the scale was also different in the sense that these entities, Kinko's, Texaco, they're much more efficient when it comes time to pay. When you and I were in the library putting in our quarters, what could we do? If we wanted to throw 5 cents back to Pearson Education, the publisher of the book, we'd leave a nickel on the top with a sticky note. Here's a nickel, please find a way to get this. No. Whereas when you go to Kinko's, they do so much photocopying. They have so many relationships with the publishers. They're well positioned not only to make a lot of copies, increasing harm, but to figure out an efficient way to pay for them. Reach out to the Copyright Clearance Center, reach out to the publisher. They're beautifully placed. Scale and efficiency. They're more efficient at copying and they're more efficient at paying, all of which matters to our analysis. All right, that's the first example. The famous case is Texaco. What's important to me is seeing how we made room for the copyright holders to create, in this instance, the Copyright Clearance Center. Right? Let's find a way to get this licensed, then maybe we get the win-win. You still do the research, but we still take care of the copyright holders, so we get the work. That's the Texaco case. The other case on this theme that I want to point out is a case involving the Sega game console. This is a great case. Sega had made its console, and Sega also had licensed games. So you could buy the console from Sega, and there were official games that Sega endorsed. They made deals for some official games. Somebody else shows up, a company called Accolade, and says, we'd like to make games, and we don't want to be your partner. We just want to make games. We don't want to be officially licensed. We don't want to pay you. We just want to make games that work with your system. And what they did is they bought a bunch of Sega games and they engaged in reverse engineering, which is to say they took the games, they ran them through a bunch of computers, they ripped them apart. I imagine them taking a hammer and smashing the game open, but it was more sophisticated than that. They studied the games, they studied the codes to learn, how does the console work? I get a bunch of your games, and I realize in all your games, you're using the same little code to turn on the screen. Or you're using the same little code to receive joystick information. And so Accolade, the new game entrant, bought a bunch of Sega games. They reverse engineered by studying the code, and then they wanted to make their own games. And Sega sued. And Sega's theory was you engaged in 1061 reproduction as you reverse engineered. When you got our games and you made copies in your computer systems to reverse engineer, you made copies of our code, 1061. Note, this is not a lawsuit against Accolade's games. It's against the process Accolade used to reverse engineer. There was copying of our games along the way. That was the case. Accolade, as you can guess, given it's a video about fair use, Accolade says, you're right, we copied 1061, but it should be deemed fair use. Again, a bunch of things I want to say to you about the case. First, the goal of the reverse engineering on Accolade's side was to get what was 102B information. Remember 102B, we did Feist, for example. We talked about 102B, saying that copyright only protects expression. It doesn't protect ideas, facts, and so on. And to their credit, Accolade was doing the reverse engineering to pull this factual information out. What codes turn the thing on, what codes receive joystick information, and so on. They didn't actually want to copy the expression of the games. You had a football game, good for you. If I do one, I do my own. You had some sort of adventure game, good for you. If I do one, I'll do one on my own. They just wanted the 102B information. The problem for them, though, is it was wrapped up in expression. The only way to see it was to get an officially licensed game, reverse engineer, again, making 1061 copies so you could really study it and rip it apart. And so to get to the 102B material, they had to copy expression. It was kind of a trap, a trick, a moat, however you want to think about it. Copyright was surrounding the prize. Now, on Sega's side, even if they acknowledge all that, Sega says there's a whole bunch of reasons that I don't want you making unauthorized games. For example, in a world of games that are authorized, I make sure that the games are offered up at different times of the year. Every month or two, there's a new game, keeping excitement going for my platform. By contrast, in a world where I don't coordinate, the fear is all of you guys will make games at Christmas, and that's about it. Right? Having control might beneficially space the games out. Sega also said, I worry about quality. Indeed, play the Christmas story out. If everybody can make games for my system and you guys all show up at Christmas, Christmas is an odd time because typically it's, grandma buying a video game for Junior, which means if you roll out a terrible game, it still might sell. Grandma doesn't know. Grandma goes to Best Buy, puts down her 60, 70, 80 bucks, brings the game home, and then Junior says, oh, that's a terrible game. Because of that confusion, I want ball control. I want to make sure only good games are released because I don't want my system to get the reputation of it's not a good system, or to disappoint grandma Christmas after Christmas such that she stops trying to buy games for Junior. But maybe even more importantly, Sega's best argument, its main argument, is that if Sega controls the games, if we don't let Accolade reverse engineer, if Sega controls the games, then Sega can do something interesting with respect to pricing. And what Sega wanted to do, and what Microsoft does with the Xbox, and what Sony does with the PlayStation, and what Nintendo has done with its hardware, what Sega wanted to do was sell the original hardware at a little bit below cost. And the reason they wanted to do that is if they charged the full cost of the hardware, they'd have trouble getting a lot of people into the market. You're a college student, you're pulling together pizza money, and maybe you can gather $250, $300, but if you had to pay $500 or $600, you might not be able to buy the hardware. And so Sega, their strategy was, we'll sell the hardware for a loss, but then since we make all the games, if it's only authorized games, if we make all the games, then gradually over time, we'll sell you overpriced games, and you'll pay us back. I'll sell you a $60 game and a $70 game and a $60 game, and although I lost money when you bought the hardware, I'll make it up over the life of the console. But the only way for that to work is if Sega's in control of the games. If other folks can come in and make the games, either they'll compete those prices down or they'll make the money. Not Sega. And so Sega wanted authorized games that could do this thing where they would charge a low price to bring you into the ecosystem and then make it up over time. Sega had a really powerful factor 4 explanation of if you let them copy the expression through their reverse engineering, which then lets them enter it with the games, that messes up the economic value of my console ecosystem, my copyrighted code, and the like. They had a story too. Had Sega won, they didn't. Had Sega won, this case would have championed what we call today systems competition. And the idea would be that Sega would have control of its games, Microsoft and the Xbox would have control of its games, Nintendo would have control of its games, and so on. Each of the console makers would have control of its games, but we'd still have competition, because Sony and its accessories would compete with Microsoft, and its accessories would compete with Nintendo and its accessories, and so on. Systems competition. We don't necessarily need competition within each ecosystem. Right? It doesn't have to be that anyone who wants can make games for the Xbox and we have massive competition in making games for the Xbox. That might be fine, but it undermines all those things I mentioned about Christmas and quality and pizza money and the like. We don't need that. We still get robust competition, which disciplines prices and motivates innovation. We get robust competition from systems competition, because Sony and Xbox and Nintendo and the others, they're constantly fighting it out for the next customer. And the next customer is looking and saying, well, the last time one of my friends got a Sony device, the games weren't so good over time. I'm not going to do that again. There is competition. It's system against system against system over time, which might be good competition. Again, that was what would have been protected had this been deemed to not be fair use. The court decided it was fair use. It's a really famous case. The court said reverse engineering is allowed. Even if you have to do some copying along the way, reverse engineering is allowed. And so that opened up the door to the market structure that we have in a lot of markets today, where I can kind of force my way in. You make the console, you have authorized games, I reverse engineer your games, figure out how to make my own, and away I go. Reverse engineering is viewed to be a permissible way to go ahead and get access to the 102B information to then enter a market, even if you're not wanted there by the entity that launched the relevant platform. This was deemed to be fair use. Now, what's really cool is what happens next. Because if you're Sony or Microsoft, you don't say, I lost, and just go home with your tail between your legs. You keep playing, and it turns out the console makers had some really good moves in response. For example, today, most consoles, the way you get the game isn't by buying a CD at Best Buy. Instead, you plug in a Cat6 cable to the back, and you connect to, in Microsoft's case, the Microsoft network, in Sony's case, the Sony network, and you get the game from the relevant company. Which is to say, they locked it up again. Accolade, you can make games, I guess, if you want to, sure, but how are you going to deliver them to the console if everybody gets their games to the console by connecting to our proprietary ecosystem through an internet cord? And so they locked it up in that way. They did other things too. Just one more example. Microsoft saw all this and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make my operating system really complicated. I could make it easier, but that would make it easy for folks to reverse engineer. So what I'm going to do is make it ungodly complicated. All sorts of hard variable names and data structures such that you can try if you want to, but you have a lot of pressure to come work with me. If you work with me, I'll show you how to use it. If you work with me, I'll test it on my systems to make sure it really works. By adding complexity, I make it harder to reverse engineer, which brings you home. Just because you lose a case doesn't mean we're all done thinking about how we want to shape the market. And Microsoft and Nintendo and Sony, they really want systems competition, and they do a whole bunch of things to try to maintain it. 2 more thoughts in this run. I want to think about how these ideas apply elsewhere, really focusing primarily on the Sega case. First thing, I just want to point out to you that this idea of taking 102B material and wrapping it in expression to then trigger a copyright case, it does happen from time to time. Another example, just to help you see, apparently there's this huge market in garage door openers. You have a motor that actually lifts the garage, and you have the little button you keep in your car to open and close the garage. Apparently people lose them, and there's this great market in buying replacement openers. Well, the companies that make the motors, they'd really like you to buy the remote from them. And so what a couple of them have done is when the remote, you push the button and it sends its signal, instead of just sending something simple, 0110179 or some other numeric code, they would have it say something expressive. Like the remote would say to the motor, roses are red, violets are blue, I want to go home now and so do you. And then the garage would open. And so when somebody else made a remote that also said that magic poem, the garage door company sued. And it's a case like Sega in the sense that they took something that was kind of 102B. The reason you want that in your remote is just to open the garage door. You don't even listen to what it says. It's silent to you. It's just transmitting the information. It's really a 102B fax kind of stuff. But the garage door companies tried to wrap it in expression, so you'd have to trip over copyright law on your way to opening the door. And they lost those cases, as you can well imagine. But it's clever that the companies try to use copyright as a barrier that protects other things. The other application I just want to mention to you is AI. The AI companies, I think they're going to want to wrap themselves in Sega. Sega teaches that reverse engineering to learn stuff is okay. Remember, the Sega case wasn't about an infringement allegation against the downstream games. It's not like Sega said that Accolade's games were infringing. Sega said that the process by which you trained your engineers so they could write those games, that was the problem. And yeah, that sounds a lot like AI. AI is taking a lot of copyrighted material. They're engaging in 106.1 reproduction, maybe 106.2 derivative work, other things. They're engaged in 106 violations to kind of study it, to figure it out. And then the AI is producing its own work. Now, if that output is too similar to someone else's input, we have a copyright case. If my AI spits out a novel and it looks a lot like yours, great, normal copyright case, let's figure it out. But the companies are getting sued for training. And I think they're going to say, Sega, Sega, Sega. They're going to say, Sega teaches us that you can violate 106 if what you're doing is learning, in the AI case, learning how sentences work, learning how images work, learning some of the subtleties of all of that, if what you're doing is learning to then produce a unique product that is not infringing. And again, if it turns out to be infringing, sue me. But they're going to say Sega, the reverse engineering case, is their case. And indeed, I think I'm going to say it on 2 levels, that it protects reverse engineering in general when I get legal access to a bunch of source material and I use it to train my AI. And I think they're even going to say it if they get caught, as some of them have been, taking material illegally. They download stuff illegally from the internet. They then feed it into their AI. I think they're going to say, I get it, it's a 106.1 violation. I downloaded it illegally. But Sega teaches that we forgive even unauthorized copying of protected expression when it's being used to reverse engineer. So I think we hear a lot about these ideas in AI over the next couple years. All right, this was my second video on fair use. Again, video 1 was about parody and social commentary. This time I really wanted to think about how fair use shapes markets. We're really thoughtful in factor 4 about the markets you're in, the markets you could be in, how maybe even this particular infringer or alleged infringer really should be brought in to start chipping in, the Texaco case. And then Sega reverse engineering, I think it's going to be a huge part of how we think about technology moving forward. Even though it's a mixed bag, maybe you can hear as I talk about it, I'm really sympathetic to Sega's argument that they want to sell the console at a little bit of a loss and then control the games to make that money back. Systems competition really could work. Fair use said no. We'll continue to see that struggle in the years ahead.